Okay, so I first want to introduce you to where this material is being drawn from. So the recovery colleges are a very new concept in Canada, and they started off in the UK and then in Australia. So there's an organization called the Center for Clinical Interventions that's in Australia, and this is the material that we're going to be using today, and this is the material that we use to guide our discussions around assertiveness. So I just wanted to show you the first little bit of what assertiveness is and really draw your attention to this diagram here. So as I use this workbook, please feel free to enter some questions and such in the chat if you're comfortable, and I'll be happy to answer those. So what exactly is assertiveness and why is it important? Why are you all here today, really? And it says here, we have all heard people say you need to be more assertive, but what exactly is assertiveness? Assertiveness is a communication style. It is being able to express your feelings, thoughts, beliefs, and opinions in an open manner that doesn't violate the rights of others. We will talk about the rights in the next little bit here. So before I introduce you to the rights, I want to let you know what the different types of assertiveness is and communication styles. It says here, other communication styles you may have heard include being aggressive, which is a style that violates the rights of others, and being passive, where we violate our own rights. You've probably also heard of passive aggressive. This is where someone is essentially being aggressive, but in a passive or indirect way. For example, someone may be angry, but they don't act in an overtly aggressive way by yelling or hitting. Instead, they may sulk or slam a door. So this is the image I want to draw your attention to. And it's about the sort of, to me, I see it as like a spectrum. So on the left-hand side, we have passive communication. On the right-hand side, we have aggressive communication. And right in the middle, we have assertive communication. So under a passive communication here, it violates our own rights. We violate our own rights that I will certainly be discussing in the upcoming little bits of today's discussion. And we give others' needs a priority. Assertive communication respects both our own needs and the needs of others. In other words, it's really about negotiating. Okay, so we're going to really kind of draw on our negotiating skills or work on our negotiating skills. And I'm going to leave you with some tools today. And then if we go to the far right hand of our communication style, we have an aggressive communication approach, which violates the rights of others. And in this communication style, we give our own needs priority rather than kind of creating a balance between the two. Okay, so I'm just taking a look at the chat here, and I'm seeing that there's some questions around getting the material. I'm happy to share this material as I've done with OCC. So absolutely, you can definitely get the workshop material today. Okay, and I encourage you to do that because I'm going to leave you with some tools today to work on. So let's jump into today's discussion. So we're going to take a walk through unassertive thinking and what has caused us to be unassertive beings, and talk about the assertiveness rights and what we sort of adhere to and what we want to honor. So we'll talk about those assertive rights. We're going to give some solutions then. So now that we've sort of explored what assertiveness is and set some goals around it, we want to change our beliefs around assertiveness. Okay. I'm going to introduce you to two tools. The first is thought diaries, and the second is behavioral experiments. And I'll also introduce you to when you can use these two pieces. Then we'll summarize this module, and I'll open up for some more discussion. Okay. So let's dive into it here. We have unassertive thinking. As we discussed in module one of the factors, so that image that I showed you before, one of the factors that can make it difficult for us to be assertive is our thinking. We all hold beliefs about ourselves, other people, and how the world works. Usually these beliefs came from our experience in the world and made sense to us at the time. However, even though we have moved on from these experiences, we may not have updated our thinking. For example, as a child, we may have been taught by our family not to express sadness because if we did, we would be ridiculed. In that situation, it would have made sense for us to have the belief expressing sadness is bad. And if I do, people will make fun of me. As an adult, however, we may still have this belief, even though we are no longer in the same situation. Okay, that's a really important part, and we'll dive into that a little bit. We continue to assume that the belief is true without checking it out. As a result, we may never express our sadness, which may result in us being stressed, depressed, and not connected with ourselves and the world. Or alternatively, our sadness may be expressed as anger towards ourselves or other people. So, some important parts here I'd like to draw out, or some important discussion points, is really about sort of replaying things that might have happened in our lives. And we do the same for others. Okay. So, I hope this helps you to sort of understand that empathy when it comes to communication is really, really important. We are only the products of our life experiences, and that is something we each need to challenge as well. So if we take on a very passive approach to communication, or even a very aggressive approach to communication, we need to sit with ourselves and sort of explore that. What could have possibly led up to us taking on that specific communication style? Perhaps you felt like your voice wasn't heard before, and you therefore need to shout it to the world, and really take your stance. But instead of being assertive, you kind of gear towards the aggressive side. Perhaps the same thing might have happened to you, but your approach to it was to be more passive, because maybe when you expressed your needs, it was met with a lot of pushback. Okay, that might have led you to have a passive communication style. We do the same for others. So we sort of observe others' communication styles and try and be empathetic towards that, because there's no guarantee around any of this in terms of how your communication style will be received. We're really challenging who we are and who we have been over the duration of our lives. And sometimes that's not necessarily met with open arms. So please be aware of that. I am going to give you the tools, but there is, and the idea is to feel better about our communication style, or give ourselves the best opportunity to be assertive, but it's not always met with welcome and open arms. Okay, so just keep that in mind. I'm going to walk you through some unassertive thoughts that I'd like you to challenge, because these are very common unassertive thoughts. If you're comfortable, please type in the chat if you agree, or if you can relate to any of these. If you have another unassertive thought, I'd like this to be as engaging as possible. So the first unassertive thought is, I shouldn't say how I'm really feeling or thinking, because I don't want to burden others with my problems. Okay. If you agree with that, or feel like that might be something that you might be going through, please type that in the chat if you'd like. If I assert myself, I will upset the other person and ruin our relationship. That's definitely an unassertive thought. It'll be terribly embarrassing if I say what I think. If someone says no to my request, it's because they don't like or love me. So this one is really interesting, because we start to sort of unpack some of the things we experienced in our past. Okay, saying no is absolutely a normal circumstance, but perhaps the no in your life was attached to another situation. Okay, or met with some sort of threat. I shouldn't have to say what I need or how I feel. People close to me should already know, right? So hoping that people can be mind readers around you is definitely unassertive. Okay. It's also not necessarily fair to those around you, because we're not communicating at all. We're not creating an environment where we can welcome positive communication and assertive communication. It is uncaring, rude, and selfish to say what you want. This one has a lot of cultural ties as well. So sometimes that's normal in certain cultures, or a perceived belief. Okay. I have no right to change my mind, neither has anyone else. Okay. It will all work out in the end. And anyway, it's not my fault. Okay. So that's a very unassertive thought and very passive thought. People should keep their feelings to themselves. Okay. Absolutely unfair to yourself if you think like this, but it is a very common unassertive thought. If I express that I'm feeling anxious, people will think I'm weak and ridicule me or take advantage of me. Okay. I have to say that I totally relate to this one. As a person who has anxiety, feeling anxious is something I thought I needed to hide all the time. And, working in a mental health organization, we appreciate this. And the reality is, many of us do feel anxious. So it kind of creates this relatability. If I accept compliments from someone, it will mean I'm big headed. Okay, that's not necessarily the case. So I just want you to take a minute and look at this list here. And I see that some of you are typing in the chat here that you can relate, and I'm really excited about that. Okay, because this means that we can start to unpack reasons around why we might have these unassertive thoughts. Okay, we'll move forward. So let's take a look at our assertive rights, and I've highlighted them for a specific reason because I think it's really important for you to keep these in mind, and if you can keep them on you. Generally, with my students, I ask that they even screenshot it or save it on their phones to remind themselves, especially if becoming more assertive is your goal, to remind yourselves to advocate for yourselves, and you do have these rights, especially as job seekers. You have the absolute right to advocate for yourself. And I hope that this sort of reminds you to do that. Okay, so the original idea around, sort of exploration around assertiveness started in 1979 with a book by Jay Smith. It's called When I Say No, I Feel Guilty. So, really challenging what it is about ourselves. Why is it so hard for us to be assertive, and why do we feel bad about it? So in this book, they laid out a series of assertive rights as human beings. Okay, so the first right is you have the right to judge your own behavior, thoughts, and emotions, and to take the responsibility for their initiation and consequences upon yourself. Okay, so that's a big one. So you do have the right to judge yourself. Okay. But the caveat to this little piece here is taking the responsibility. Okay, and we'll explore that as we go through this workshop. The second right is you have the right to say no. Everyone has the right to say no. We can all do it. So why is it that we feel bad about it? And why is it kind of attached to these like negative feelings? You have the right to offer no reasons or excuses for justifying your behavior. Now, we tie this back in with the idea of responsibility. So, you don't need to make an excuse for your behavior, but you do need to take responsibility for that behavior. You have the right to judge if you are responsible for finding solutions to other people's problems. I think this one has been very sort of a very popular thing that's come up at the Recovery College for the reason that, dealing with mental health issues on our end and a lot of our students wanting to support others, we feel called to solve other people's problems where perhaps that was the intention of the delivery of the conversation. Okay, maybe it was more about venting. So you do have the right to judge if you're responsible or even ready to find solutions to other people's problems. Okay, you have the right to change your mind. You have the right to disagree with with someone's opinion. Okay, these are very things I'm more so validating your feelings at this point. You have the right to make mistakes and be responsible for them. So everything gets tied back to responsibility. You can be who you want to be, but you have to be responsible for those actions that you take. So if you choose to be more of a passive communicator and you find it extremely challenging, you take on the responsibility for the consequences of being passive. The same goes with aggressive. Okay, that's the idea is that we negotiate. We learn how to negotiate so we can become more assertive communicators. Okay. Um, you have the right to say, I don't know. So you don't necessarily need to know everything. And that's okay. In fact, I actually feel like it's a great thing to say that you don't know, and rather than sort of make things up along the way, it's okay not to know things. And that's how we become better. Maybe perhaps my take on this is, from an education perspective, but it is absolutely welcomed if you don't know something because that's how we learn. And that's how we open our minds to learn. You have the right to be illogical in making decisions. So all these tie right back into the idea around responsibility. You have the right to say, I don't understand. So very similar to I don't know and ask for clarification. And you have the right to say and feel like you don't care. I know that that sounds pretty cold and it can come across as being quite aggressive, but you have the right to feel that. And again, tying back with the consequences, judge whether or not you want to take on the consequences or the responsibility for what might come out of that. Okay, so you do have all of these rights. And I also want to add an additional right to this list here, and that right is to choose when you want to be assertive. Okay. There are situations where assertiveness might be a little bit trying. So perhaps, and I'm going to give you a kind of, out of the box, a little bit of a ridiculous example. If someone was to, approach you and wanted to steal something from you, or maybe you're in like a robbery, okay? So that's probably not the best place to be your most assertive self. You want to kind of listen to what's happening because you're putting yourself in a very dangerous situation. So giving yourself the ability to choose when it is a good time to be assertive is actually taking an assertive action. Okay. So having the ability to choose and sort of evaluate the cost benefit of being assertive here is actually an assertive behavior. Okay. So assertiveness kind of goes, tenfold. And I'm really loving that the chat is kind of getting really engaged. I'm really happy that we're all engaged in this material. So it says here, and I will reiterate it, an important part of these rights is that they come linked with responsibilities. You will notice the first point says you have the right to your own thoughts, behavior, and emotions, but that you must then take the responsibility for the consequences of these thoughts and behaviors. Often people think they're behaving assertively, but they're ignoring the consequences of their actions and the rights of others. So they're not necessarily negotiating, they're not actually becoming assertive. This would be more typical of an aggressive style of communication. So if you feel like that other person on the receiving end, is not necessarily comfortable with the decision-making process, then perhaps you are taking on more aggressive style of communication. Okay. Another thing I'd like to remind you is that you're not responsible for the communication styles of other people. So if you are communicating with a very aggressive person, you're not responsible for their communication style. You're only responsible for your own. Okay. I'm just going to go scroll past here and just taking a glance here at the chat. I'm really excited to see that here, I'm seeing some some kind of comments about, dealing with assertive situations and dealing with the guilt. Yeah. So guilt is actually a very passive feeling. Okay. So guilt can actually make you take on a very passive communication style. And I will say that that's the perfect environment to sort of look back into our lives and look back into situations that might have shaped us to become more passive communicators. Why is it that we give so much power to that feelings of guilt? And sometimes we become mind readers. So when I say mind reader, sometimes we assume the worst out of a situation and we've decided how it's going to turn out, because we now have this sort of relation to something that might have happened in the past. And this is normal for our brains to do. Our brains want to create similarities to judge certain situations. But I want to challenge you on this, and I'd like to challenge you to become more assertive and think past this, for the reason that that's how the biggest changes sort of come out. Okay, and we'll explore this. So let's dive into this then. Let's talk about how we can start to change these beliefs. So first, identifying your unhelpful beliefs is, really the first step. Okay, so we look at the unassertive beliefs, and I will encourage you to expand on the list that we've created and identify those thoughts that you might have quite commonly. So these are thoughts that might just be sort of second nature. Maybe you feel, or maybe culturally you feel like being assertive is actually being rude. Okay, or asking for your needs is being rude. It's maybe praised to be sort of selfless. But I want to challenge you on that if you can. Of course, safely do so, because we're part of being assertive is giving yourself the choice or the option of being more assertive. Okay. In fact, for some people, just realizing that they've been thinking this way can be enough to help them change, especially when they realize they have the right to change and think in a different way. So I will say that this is probably now my seventh time teaching a module like this. And every single time I teach it, the conversation is very, very different. And I learn more about myself throughout this whole teaching experience. I was a very passive communicator before. It's the people pleaser in me. And I started to look back at things in my life and I'm thinking, okay, what is it that has happened that led me to be like this? What societal things have happened, or what societal biases are placed on me that have led up to my communication style, and that feeling of guilt about being assertive and expressing my needs. Okay, so really challenge that, and it's going to take a lot of introspection. Okay, so I encourage you to use these workbooks to do that. I will say that on the website for the Center for Clinical Interventions, there's lots and lots of resources, and there's the full 10 course module. So if you find this class very fulfilling, I encourage you to finish all of the modules, and they all are very self-reflective and introspective as well. That'll help you on your journey to becoming more assertive. This is really just a small snippet of it. Okay, and it's really important, especially in your job search, to become that more assertive being. Okay. Some people just realizing that they've been thinking in an unhelpful way isn't enough to change the thinking. So perhaps you've done some self-work and you've done the introspection and you've done the digging and you find out that, hey, I'm still unassertive. I still feel guilty. I still have all of these yucky feelings about asking for my needs. How do I change that? So if we turn to an actual therapeutic approach, there's something called cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT. This is really one way of addressing unhelpful thoughts, and it's challenging them head on. So we call it disputation. In practice, it's called disputation. So challenging or disputation works on the principle that most of our thoughts and beliefs are learned opinions. So we're learning these opinions, and they're not necessarily facts. This means that they can be questioned rather than accepted blindly, particularly if they're causing distress. So we'll explore this in more detail. To challenge or dispute your thoughts means that you examine the evidence, and I'm going to highlight that word there, the evidence, because I think it's really important to consider this, and it's been quite helpful for myself when I think, what is the evidence around this? What's the evidence that I have to support this thought? Okay. You evaluate them as you are a detective or as a lawyer. You're trying to get to the bottom of the truth of the thought. Will the evidence for this thought hold up in a courtroom? Okay. So we look at it as like an internal sort of dispute. There are two major strategies that can be used to help you challenge your thoughts. And these are the two tools I'm going to give you today. So the first is thought diary, and the other is a behavioral experiment. So let's look at thought diaries. First, I just wanted to feel out the room. How many of you have experience using thought diaries or behavioral experiments? Um, you can raise your hand or type in the chat, whatever feels comfortable for you. Um, Great. I'm seeing, yes, thought diaries. Okay, I'm seeing some nevers. That's good. Good. Exciting. Okay, so thought diaries are wonderful. So I will say a little bit of a caveat, which is not discussed in this workbook. Thought diaries are the safer option. So we have two, and I'm presenting thought diaries first for this reason. So thought diaries looks at our thoughts, and then behavioral experiments is more risky because we actually try and implement or test out our thoughts. Okay, so we look at thought diaries as a way to develop a hypothesis. If we're looking at it in like sort of research terms, we want to look at a hypothesis or develop a hypothesis and think about the evidence that might support it. Whereas behavioral experiments, we're actually testing a hypothesis or putting it out into the world and testing it. So you can imagine that one is a lot easier to do than the other, or a lot safer, especially if you're a very passive communicator and want to be more introspective rather than implement something very, very sort of very forward, I would say. So the behavioral experiment, I encourage you to start off small, and I'll explain this as we go through it. But with thought diaries, start here. Okay, so everyone, I encourage you to start here prior to doing a behavioral experiment. Okay. And I'm excited that there's some folks that know what thought diaries are. So it says here, it can be difficult to challenge your thoughts in your head as it is hard to remember all the information and it can get messy and confusing. The best way is to write it all down. To help you through this process, we have the thought diary for unassertive thoughts. So this workbook is going to help you with that. We have worked through an example to show you the questions that you will need to ask yourself in order to come up with a more balanced thought. Then we provide a blank one for you to work through. So this workbook will have an example as well as a blank one. The thought diary will ask you to identify the unassertive thought that you are having. In order to do this, you'll first need to identify the situation. Okay, so this is actually pretty tough. We need to be very articulate or be very specific with with what's causing that unassertive behavior. So identify that situation. And I think thought diaries, along with any sort of a journal, is a really great way to start to document things and extract when you have a harder time than others to being assertive or to any sort of behavior. Okay, so thought diaries can sort of pinpoint perhaps a specific person, a specific environment, a specific situation, a specific time that you find it really difficult to be assertive so that it can bring some clarity into your journey to becoming more assertive beings. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through this example here. After you identify your situation, you want to identify the emotions. Okay, so that how are you feeling? So if you can be very specific here, what emotions are you feeling and how intense are they? It's asking you here to rate the intensity from 0 to 100. I actually like to look at it as a percentage. Okay, so how much of my emotions, if I look at my emotions on this like as a big piece of pie, how much of this pie, what percentage of this is my feeling? Okay, and I'll walk you through an example as we go through this. And and then from the identifying your emotions, you want to identify your behavior. So what behavior came out of your emotions? So emotions tend to sort of precede. We feel emotions first, then we take action afterwards. So it tends to precede the behavior or the action that we take. So, what did you do and how did you feel in your body? Okay, so we have an emotion prior to the action, and then you have a post action emotion and sort of feeling, a sentient sort of experience that you might have. Okay, and then lastly, you're going to identify your thoughts in that situation once more. Okay, so these thoughts can take the form of assumptions, interpretations, beliefs, values, and so on. Sometimes they even take the form of images or pictures rather than words because they happen very, very quickly. Okay, so try and catch those thoughts at that point. What was I thinking? What was running through my head? This is where you might have felt that guilt. Okay, so what image, what feeling, what led up, what happened right before I got that feeling of guilt. Okay. So we're going to explore an example. I'm just going to skip this little bit here because I want us to explore the example together. After you do all of the listing and all the identifying, I want you to rate your strengths, the strength of your beliefs, and that's the 0 to 100. So we're rating it like on a scale or on a percentage of how strong we feel that our beliefs. So we did it the first time around, and now we're going to do it again to sort of one, we're now calmer as we've listed off our situation in our thought diary. So generally you like to use a thought diary when you're feeling that strong emotion and having those strong thoughts. As you start to write it out and list it out, we can then challenge it and reevaluate it after we sort of calmed down to really rate whether or not we believe that and how strong of a belief we might have. Okay, that's challenging that idea around evidence. Okay, in this sort of phase, I'm going to ask you then to consider the following questions. Am I thinking in a passive, assertive, or aggressive way? So what might help you do that is to think about the rights. Am I violating my own rights? Am I violating the rights of others? Or do we feel like we're negotiating? Okay, am I thinking very assertive? Did I respond then in a passive, assertive, or aggressive way? So sometimes your thoughts might be passive, but you're brave enough to carry out the very assertive action. Or maybe your thoughts might be aggressive, and for whatever reason, your delivery might be passive aggressive, or your delivery might be very passive. Okay, we're there sitting and sort of stewing in our thoughts at that point. What evidence do you have? So consider, what evidence do you have for and against this thought? And again, that idea of rights. Okay, so am I ignoring the rights of my friends? Am I ignoring my rights? How else can I view the situation? So when we look at CBT, it's sometimes about giving advice. So, like, what advice? And we look at compassion too. What advice would you give somebody else that might be in this experiencing this specific situation? So we take that third party lens and sort of observe the situation, and observe it without emotions. Okay. Are there any other interpretations of what happened? And we'll definitely get a chance to go through this. So it says here, the idea behind asking yourself these questions is to come up with a more balanced and assertive way of thinking and behaving. So we start to ask ourselves, what would be a more assertive way of thinking or responding? Okay, and then we walk through the re-ratings. We're really sort of playing the situation in our mind over and over and challenging that, just like how you would do in a courtroom, right? We play that same situation that might have happened, and we evaluate. We continuously evaluate. And the idea around this is that as we start to evaluate, so generally the first time you use a thought diary, it's going to take you some time. And the more you use a thought diary, you might find that you're not as detailed because it kind of comes naturally to you. And eventually you won't need the thought diary because you can challenge your thoughts right away. And that's the progression of a CBT sort of style. Okay, so let's look at this example. So let's understand our reaction. So it says here the situation is that you might have asked a friend to go shopping with you and she said no. These are very silly examples, but these are the kinds of things that draw the unassertive behavior out of us. Okay, so I asked a friend to go shopping with me and she said no. What emotions did I feel and how strong were these emotions? Well, I felt hurt and I felt angry. Now, if I look at the percentage of my emotions, I maybe feel about 70% angry, okay, and about 80% hurt. Out of, if we look at like a percentage or a big piece of pie. So how much of this piece of pie of hurt do I feel, and how angry do I feel? I only feel about 70 and 80%. What physical response did I notice in my body? Well, I start to observe. I'm tense, my chest is tight, my jaw is clenched. I actually feel nauseous when I think about this person because now I'm starting to attach yucky feelings to this person. And then how did I react? So what actions did I take? I cried, then I ignored the next phone call I had from her. And then I look at that behavior and I think, okay, what response was this? What was this a passive, assertive, or aggressive way of behaving? And it's certainly passive aggressive because I cried and then I decided to ignore the next phone call I had from her. So we're seeing a very passive response and a very aggressive sort of action. Okay. What thoughts were running through my head? Well, this is going to take a little bit of working on. I said yes to go shopping with her when I didn't want to. So she should have said yes to me. So now we're starting to violate rights here. She is selfish. I to say no. Maybe she doesn't like me anymore. So lots of things that are running through my head. Out of all these thoughts, which is the strongest thought? She is selfish for saying no. Okay. Now, how much did I believe that thought? We're starting to bring it back to that evaluation. What's the percentage of me believing that thought? I believed it 80% in the moment. So are these passive, assertive, or aggressive thoughts? I think they're very passive thoughts because I thought I should do something I didn't want to do. And I think that they might be aggressive because I think that she should do what I want her to do. So now we're starting to bring some clarity here. Okay. Now is when we start to dispute these thoughts. Okay. So this is where we kind of draw or challenge it in our court of life here. So is there any evidence that my thought is true? There's absolutely no evidence around it. Is there any evidence that my thought is not true? She's done a lot of things with me and for me over the course of our friendship. Am I ignoring the rights or the rights of another person? If so, what am I ignoring? I'm absolutely ignoring some rights here. So, yes, I ignored my rights by saying yes when I didn't want to go shopping. And I'm ignoring her rights by acting as if she should do what I want. The right I'm ignoring is everyone has the right to say no. Okay, so the idea around this, and I'm going to highlight it, is that you look at, I'm going to highlight in the same color that I highlighted the rights before, because I think it's really important to specifically identify what rights are being ignored so we can start to make some changes. So the next question that we ask ourselves are there any other ways of interpreting the situation? Sometimes I will say this question is really hard, and if you have somebody around you that you trust and somebody that you go to that is a supportive person for you, and they're well aware that they're that supportive person to you, you might want to unload this or unpack it with them. Okay. Of course, that's if that person is ready and welcoming of it. So please be mindful of that. So this person might help you to unpack that she might be tired. She may not want to go shopping. She may have something else on. And you might realize, hey, I think I'm mind reading what she's thinking. I've said no to her sometimes, but that didn't mean I didn't like her. So we're starting to sort of be a little bit more empathetic here. And I really want you to be empathetic when it comes to communication, because we all have our own individual stories. Every single one of us have our own lived experience and our own lived stories that have shaped our communication style and our delivery and our reactions around things. The next question is, what would be a more assertive way to think about this? So this is going to take a little bit of work. She has a right to say no, and that doesn't mean that she is selfish, nor does it say anything about what she may or may not think about me. So we're working our way through this. What would have been a more assertive way to behave? So rather than hanging up the phone or ignoring the phone calls, what would have been a more assertive way to behave? I will suggest catching up another time, doing something that we both like. So maybe providing a solution. Now that we're all calm and we've unpacked everything and we've taken the time on making this thought diary, let's re-rate our emotions. Now, maybe perhaps you're feeling 20% hurt, or your piece of pie, that slice is getting a little smaller, or piece of pie of angry, I'm only now 10% angry. And how much do I believe this? Only about 10%. Okay, so my original thought is now disputed. And by doing this, you've actually practiced CBT. Okay, so my homework for you is really to try, and the next time you identify unassertive behavior, whether that is aggressive or passive or even passive aggressive behavior, if you identify a thought, so typically we associate emotions with our behaviors. So if a situation has happened and you don't feel very good after that interaction, perhaps you had an interaction with a family member or a sibling or a friend, and you didn't feel very good afterwards, likely there's some sort of issue with assertiveness there. Assertiveness is about negotiation. So typically with negotiation, we both parties feel maybe perhaps your needs didn't get entirely met, but you feel comfortable because you've negotiated that. Okay, so think about a situation. So as you go through your day and perhaps your week, think about when you might have that as really strong emotion around an interaction with somebody, and challenge your unassertive thoughts using the thought diary. It's really great if you can catch it in the moment, but if you can't, that's totally okay. You can work through it after the fact as well. But you can certainly see the digression. So we start to see like the heated feeling, and that rating might be really high. And then as you work through this thought diary, the rating tends to lessen as we begin to challenge our thoughts. So in this workbook, you do have a blank thought diary here with the part 1 and the part 2, and it asks you the exact same questions in those prompts. And then the last little tool, so I just wanted to see if anybody had any questions about thought diaries. I'm just going to take a look at the chat. I'll give about a minute. So please feel free to share any questions about thought diaries before I move on to behavioral experiments. Yeah, I'm seeing Arena post. I think it's also important to make a distinction between no and the not right now. So saying not right now is very assertive as well. Regardless of which response you receive, asking why may not be the right thing to ask right away. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So, making that distinction. So perhaps you do have the time to go to the mall, if we look at that example, right? But maybe it's now is not the time or not right now. So explaining that. So we look, if you choose to complete all these modules and you choose to complete them on your own on the website, you will definitely be able to explore this, where yes, you may not necessarily need to give somebody an explanation. It's part of honoring your rights is, you don't have to explain certain behaviors, but sometimes your relationship with that person, you feel like that person deserves an explanation, right? Maybe not right now because I'm not feeling really great or I'm not feeling myself right now, and you feel comfortable enough sharing that. That's still an assertive behavior. I know that sometimes we feel like that might be passive because providing an explanation around an action or a need is actually can become quite passive if we start to over explain things. But sometimes it's needed to enhance communication, right? Sometimes it's needed to honor and to explain and to empathize with that person or to create clarity with the person as to what you mean by this. So maybe you feel like no might be a little bit harsh because you maybe actually can't, you feel the yes, but not now is not the right time. Absolutely do not right now or say not right now. Okay, so again, being assertive is about giving yourself the ability to choose. Irina, I wanted to commend you for this. I'm practicing giving people space to say no so that when I do, they can accept no for what it is. Yeah. So the idea is that we practice what we preach, right? So we want to create that environment or that space that is conducive of assertive communication. Okay. So let's take a look at behavioral experiments here. I don't see any other questions regarding thought diaries, but if you do have any that kind of come along the way, please feel free to share those questions. So doing a thought diary can help to sort of challenge and change our beliefs about a situation. And this is especially true when we write down and practice our new thoughts over and over again. Okay, so again, that's the idea around the more we do thought diaries, the easier it becomes. And sometimes we don't necessarily even need to write it down. It all happens in our mind at that point because it becomes second nature to us. However, sometimes it's hard for us to shift our beliefs when all we're doing is writing down our thoughts. Okay, so I'm seeing some comments about, writing sometimes is a little bit challenging and, maybe you lose focus as you write. But so perhaps the behavioral experiment is what's right for you. We might see that it makes sense logically, but feel inside that nothing has really changed. So working through a thought diary is not as helpful as you expected it to be. Thought diaries may also be difficult to use when there's no real evidence for or against a particular situation. For example, we may have a belief that we don't always do what someone else wants us to do, then they won't like us anymore. Okay, so that example, we may have the belief that if we don't always do what someone else wants us to do, then they won't like us anymore. So that was a very common belief. We are unlikely to put ourselves in the situation to test this out using a thought diary. So this is why behavioral experiments become really important, but also very challenging. Okay. So we insert the behavioral experiment here, and this helps us to give us that evidence. So we're now starting to support the thought diary by providing the thought diary with that evidence. So for example, someone may have the belief, if I assert myself, then I will upset the other person and ruin our relationship. This belief has meant that the person has always gone along with what others suggest, even though it may be the complete opposite of what they really want to do. They believe it so much that they have never considered trying to assert themselves. They've completed some thought diaries and realized that they don't really have any evidence to support their belief. However, neither do they have the evidence against it, so they feel a bit stuck. So now they decide that one day they can find out. One way they can find out is to do an experiment where it actually tests their prediction that the other person will be upset with the relationship and will be ruined. This will be a challenge as it can be quite anxiety provoking. When deciding to do an experiment, it's important that you plan it carefully so that the results will be clear. Also, you may need to start with an easier experiment. So again, that same caveat that I mentioned before, if you are to choose a behavioral experiment, please choose it with a person or a situation that you feel comfortable in and safe in, and you feel like that person might be inviting of this, at least for your first one. Okay, so before we start to take on, kind of more challenging situations, you want to make sure that it's not going to deter us from ever doing it again. So we look at things like high risk, high reward, but in this case, low risk can be equally rewarding. Okay, so we see that high risk environment. Maybe you really struggle with being assertive with family members. Okay, maybe you really struggle with being assertive with your boss. Even perhaps your dynamic with your employer might be really challenging, and I will say it's not a bad thing to be assertive with your employer or your colleagues for any way, shape, or form, because we're not becoming aggressive. Okay, assertive is about asking for what it is that you need, and I think it's really important that us as employees learn to adapt that communication style. But please do so. If you're going to try a behavioral experiment, please try it, sort of in a safer environment. Maybe you feel a little bit more comfortable testing things out with a friend, and then bringing it to and sort of working your way up to that situation that might cause you the most anxiety. Okay. So let's use this example. If I assert myself, then I'll upset the other person and ruin our relationship. Okay, so let's think about the first step. So the first step is to identify the prediction that you have about the situation and how you will know if it's happened. It's an important step, as if you don't make it clear and how you will know as to how you will know it has happened, then it can easily shift the goalpost for the experiment. So we're creating a sound hypothesis here. You also need to identify any unassertive or unhelpful behaviors that you normally do. So look at yourself as well. You're doing more of an introspective sort of exercise here, in addition to a firm hypothesis. Okay. So you can actually use a thought diary to extract this information, or start off with a thought diary and work your way up into a behavioral experiment. So we're starting to build a sound hypothesis and then creating that environment to test the evidence that we or to create some evidence that support or sort of that are for or against that thought that we might have. And then we set up the experiment. So let's look at what this looks like at the bottom here. So I do want to leave you with this example. So the first the first is listing off the situation. The situation is telling your friend that you don't want to go shopping with her. The prediction is that she'll be upset and angry and not want to be your friend anymore. And how much you believed it in the beginning, it's about 70%. Okay. How will you know it's happened? This is really the challenging one, right? We really need to think about it. What will indicate that your friend no longer likes you? She will hang up on you and not return your calls anymore. Okay, now we move on to step 2 and identify unhelpful behaviors. So we start to look at ourselves and some things that you might have done. Perhaps you're making up excuses, you pretend to be sick, you avoid her until it's too late because you just don't want to deal with the situation that might make you feel guilty, that might make you feel those sort of yucky feelings around taking an action that's unusual to you. Step 3 is reminding yourself of the more realistic prediction that you may have had. So you can use this from your thought diary, or you can, if you feel comfortable, you can create this one. And you can also do this last as well. So step 3 can happen at the very end. So to give you an example of this, it says she has said no to me before, and that was fine. She may be disappointed, but if she's a good friend, she won't be angry and our friendship will be fine. So this can also be supported by that person that you might sort of debrief with, or your the person that you kind of have those conversations with about things that might bother you. Maybe even if you have a counselor, they'll certainly be able to help you to identify a more realistic prediction. Okay. Step 4 is identify behaviors. So what will I do differently to test out the 2 predictions? So the behaviors that you might identify is, instead of avoiding her, I'll call her today first thing and explain that I have a meeting I need to prepare for, so don't want to go shopping. I'll organize another time to catch up with her, right? So then we're starting to sort of really be specific with the behaviors. And step 5, so let's carry it out. This is where we start to be a little bit brave, and this is where it can be really challenging before we start to evaluate our results. So what actually happened? You carried out all of your steps here, and what actually happened? She said it was fine, and in fact, it suited her too. We made a time for coffee next week. So if we look at all of this, our minds were racing throughout this whole process. You started to feel these strong emotions. You started to get overheated. You were 70% upset, and you had a lot of anger around it too. And when you carried out the behavior, or carried out this behavioral experiment, you realized that the reaction that you anticipated didn't happen. Okay, or maybe it did happen, and now you have evidence for it. So how much was your original prediction? How much did your original prediction come true? 0%. And which prediction was supported? The more realistic one. So we listed off. Perhaps you looked at into a third party to sort of give you a more realistic one. What was it like to behave differently? So you might list off some. This is a little bit of a journal for yourself. Perhaps it was scary, it was difficult at first, but then it got easier. And what did you learn from your experiment? You learned that you tend to expect the worst, and this has kept you from behaving in a passive way. It felt good to be honest and direct. Being assertive doesn't mean that people will be upset with you. Okay, that's a really important part. If they are, then that's their problem to work on. So again, we can't necessarily be responsible for the communication styles of others. And here's your blank page to work on that. Okay, and those are really your two tools that I wanted to leave you with to challenge your thinking, to prepare an environment that's open and welcoming of assertive behavior, to also implement those assertive behaviors. Okay. So to summarize, our thinking can sometimes stop us from behaving assertively. I also want to add to here being empathetic as to the communication styles of others, and consider what life occurrences or what life experiences might have led to that person becoming the communicators that they are. Being assertive involves a number of rights, but also a number of responsibilities. We have a responsibility to ourselves and also to the people we're interacting with. Okay, so please honor your rights and keep that in as perhaps a screenshot, or revisit it quite often to remind yourself. It's more of validating that, hey, you do have the right to say no. You don't need to give an explanation, and so forth. And lastly, we can change our non-assertive thinking by using cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT tools, such as the thought diary or behavioral experiments. Okay. And I just want to open it up and see if anybody had any questions about the two tools I've given you and some of the discussion that we've had today. Does anybody have any questions for me today? Again, the website is the Center for Clinical Interventions if you're curious and you want to work through all these modules. Great. I'm so glad, Leah. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Just going to take a look at the chat here and see if I missed anything. Okay. Yeah, Irina, you have your hand up. You can. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yes, thanks so much for the presentation. Lots of helpful tips here. I was just wondering whether you have any tips for how to be assertive but not come off as like too intense. I've been described as passionate, and I don't know how to interpret that.
Oh, okay. So Irina, I think in this case, it depends on the environment that you're presenting your assertive behavior with. Sometimes it can be a little bit of a blur between assertiveness and aggressiveness, or it can be perceived that way, especially if you're taking on a new communication style. So perhaps, and I'll give you a kind of a simple example here. So perhaps your family is very accustomed to you taking on a very passive communication style. And then you suddenly decide to try, because you've done your thought diaries, you're willing to do a behavioral experiment, you try to become an assertive communicator, and that took your family by surprise. So sometimes it takes the people around us by surprise when we adapt a communication style that's not necessarily something that is intrinsically us, or something that we've always been. And this is particularly true of people who know us for some time. And then sometimes we feel like we're being assertive in a new environment, And sometimes our passions, so like you mentioned, sometimes our passions might draw us to becoming a little bit more of an aggressive communicator. So I think in your case, Irina, it'd be worthwhile sort of taking on that third party lens that I mentioned before, in terms of like using your thought diary to kind of unpack perhaps what somebody else might have seen, and listing off the behaviors that you might have taken, to determine whether if they were surprised by your assertive behavior because your behavior was truly assertive, or perhaps your behavior might have sort of, like we look at it as a spectrum, might have drifted from the assertive piece and maybe sort of started to touch on the aggressive piece a little. It does take a lot of introspection though, and open-mindedness, and it's really hard to challenge our own thoughts and our own behaviors. And I hope that you do so in an environment that's safe and feels comfortable for you. Does that answer your question, Irina?
Yes, definitely. Thank you for your response.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I'm just going to take a look at the chat here and see if I've missed anything. Okay, so I see a question here. What's the best way to respond if you just don't want to do something? This is coming from a people pleaser. Oh my goodness. Okay, Saba, this is a really tricky one, right? So I think in this case, it's about sort of stating, I think rather than saying, because you are a people pleaser, it's going to be, I'm trying to do this, to articulate this in the best way possible, because I think I don't want you to feel bad about saying I don't want to, because as a people pleaser and a very passive communicator, you will take that home with you. You feel like your words don't match how you feel on the inside, okay? So in this case, I would absolutely implement a thought diary to help you to create that prediction, because I think when it comes to being a people pleaser, we anticipate what somebody might say or how somebody might react. Okay, so maybe you don't want to do something. Maybe you don't want to, I don't know, babysit your neighbor's kid for the 6th day in a row, but you want to be a people, you want to please that person. You don't want them to be hurt. So you start to think things, okay, I wonder if I'll hurt them and they're not going to like me, and our relationship is going to change. So using that thought diary and listing off all these feelings, and determining whether there's any sort of linkages. Maybe you've said no before, but it's not the exact same situation, and the reaction was, hey, no problem. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So sort of sitting with that to create a plan of action. Okay, but I definitely feel like you probably don't want to turn to I don't want to, because it can, again, come across as being aggressive, especially if you've always been a people pleaser. We look at both. Yes, you're not responsible for the communication style of another person, but it does catch people by surprise. If you've always been a people pleaser and all of a sudden you're more assertive, someone might think, oh my goodness, what's going on with Saba today? Why have they become like this? Or, they must be having a bad day. And that's not necessarily the case. And you're on the inside sort of stewing and trying to figure out what's going on, that's going to help you to feel emotionally okay going forward. So certainly use a thought diary, Saba, if you have the opportunity to.
Candace, it's Lisa. We're about up for our time, but I wanted to thank you. What an amazing workshop. If everybody can give a hand clap, that was really, really great. What I'll do is, if we have any questions that come up that aren't answered, we'll have you send those to Elizabeth Novak and she'll forward them on to Candace. We will make the recording and the slides available. Elizabeth will reach out to all of you. We hope you'll fill in a post-event summary as well. We really hope you'll come back. And Elizabeth, maybe you can just tell us quickly what's coming up on Thursday.
Oh, you're on mute. That's the phrase of the year.
It definitely is. Definitely is. We have a second mental health. Sorry, Candace, help me out here. We have a second mental health workshop at 1:00 on Thursday, where the Canadian Mental Health Association will join us as well. I believe the topic is
wellness.
Wellness, yes.
Yes.
So again, really, really worth your time. We hope you'll join us. Share this out with other people as we recognize Mental Health Week. Thank you. Jeff put that into the chat. We've got a couple other pieces. We've got emotional regulation in the workshop, in the workplace with Dr. Linda Shaw coming up, which will also be really great. And we have using fear to actually improve your workplace performance, and that's with Mary Poffenroth, a scientist out of the US. So Candace, maybe you'll join us for those. As always, we really appreciate everybody who came on. Thanks and have a great day.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, take care.